Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this important event on Afghanistan. It's particularly important for people on our campus at Stockton, for staff, for students, for faculty, and for community members in southern New Jersey and Philadelphia area to think about, to understand what's going on in Afghanistan, because a lot of Afghans have arrived and are arriving in our region. Therefore, we're honored and thankful for terrific speakers who have agreed to join us today. So I'll jump right into, my name is Rabbaa Siegel, and I teach in the Holocaust and Genocide Studies program here at Stockton University. And I'll jump right in to introduce the speakers according to the order in which they'll speak. Each speaker will talk for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions and further discussion. So Dr. Robert Nichols is professor of history at Stockton University, a historian of South Asia, Pakistan, and Afghanistan in the early modern, colonial, and post-colonial periods. He writes about political, economic, social, and cultural interactions across communities, as well as interregional connections between areas of the Indian Ocean world. His books include Settling the Frontier, Land, Law, and Society in the Peshawar Valley, in Oxford University Press in 2001, with a second edition 3 years ago, A History of Pashtun Migration, also at Oxford University Press in 2008, and The Frontier Crimes Regulation, A History and Documents, also at Oxford in 2013. His research article, The Pashtun Borderlands, Development, Nation, and Agency, is forthcoming this October in the journal Afghanistan. Sunita Viswanath has worked for over 25 years in women's rights and human rights organizations. In 2001, Sunita co-founded the International Women's Human Rights Organization, Women for Afghan Women, and currently serves as board chair for the organization. Sunita has edited Women for Afghan Women, Shattering Myth and Claiming the Future in 2003, a book of essays. For her work with Women for Afghan Women, Sunita has been awarded the Feminist Majority Foundation's Global Women's Rights Award in 2011. Sunita also co-founded Sadhana in 2011 in order to mobilize Hindu Americans to connect their faith to social justice and human rights, and serves on Sadhana's executive board. She was honored by President Obama at the White House in 2015 as a champion of change for her work with Sadhana. In June 2019, Sunita also co-founded Hindus for Human Rights. And in 2021, this year, Sunita was recognized by the Center for American Progress as one of 21, quote, faith leaders to watch, end quote. Previously, Sunita worked with a sister fund and the funders concerned about AIDS, and she's an advisory board member of Population Media Center, which uses entertainment education and mass media to promote social and cultural change. Dr. Husnul Amin is Associate Professor of Politics and the Executive Director of the Iqbal International Institute for Research and Dialogue in the International Islamic University of Islamabad. He was a Fulbright Research Fellow here at Stockton University in 2019-2020, working primarily on recent civic rights social mobilizations in the northeast of Pakistan. Dr. Husnul Amin obtained his PhD in Development Studies with further specialization in political sociology in 2010 from the International Institute of Social Studies in The Hague. His dissertation concerned the genesis and proliferation of post-Islamist intellectual and social political trajectories in Pakistan. He was awarded research fellowships at the Free University in Berlin, William and Mary in Virginia, and the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. His most recent book is Observing Various Variants of Post-Islamism, Intellectual Discourses and Social Movements, last year. Lucy Rabbaa has worked with refugees and asylum seekers since 2007, taking on a variety of roles as caseworker and interpreter at the Resettlement Support Center in Bangkok, Thailand, as health access coordinator with the International Rescue Committee in Oakland, California, as preferred communities program officer with the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants in Arlington, and as program director at the Siley Women Enterprise in Baltimore. In addition, during the Mediterranean migration crisis in 2016, Lucy Rabbaa volunteered with two nonprofit organizations in Malta, Migrant Offshore Aid Station and Foundation for Shelter and Support to Migrants, supporting the research and rescue efforts and community integration programs for migrants and asylum seekers. Lucy Rabbaa received her master's in social work from Temple University in Philadelphia and a Master of Science in Refugee and Forced Migration Studies from the University of Oxford. Again, thank you very much for a very impressive panel of speakers. I'm very much looking forward to hearing your talks and to engaging in this important discussion. So please, Dr. Nichols.
So thank you, Raz. Let me thank the sponsors of this panel, Raz and JY, who organized things, Global Engagement, Global Studies, Lauren, the School of Arts and Humanities. And I'm especially happy to see our guest speakers and to listen to Sunita and Lucy talk about their work. And it's good to see my old friend Husnul Amin again. So I will take on some of the politics of Afghanistan and set the stage for people who haven't been paying too much attention. This is a picture of the Panjshir Valley in Afghanistan, which was in the news. That was going to be a potential site of resistance, but it didn't really happen. A map of Afghanistan, National Geographic in their September issue this year has a story about the 20th anniversary of September 11th. And they have an interesting set of maps and statistics about Afghanistan. For our panel, especially, if you don't know the geography of Afghanistan very well, the capital Kabul in the east, near the border with Pakistan, and the tribal areas, the Pashtun areas in Pakistan, have always been a part of the story of the last 20 years. Many of the Taliban took refuge in the tribal areas and the border areas. And one of the reasons that the outcome of the last 20 years was what happened on August 15th with the fall of Kabul, is that there were always refuge areas for the Taliban to regroup and refit and get support from their allies on the Pakistan side. So some statistics. I have these PowerPoint slides available. I'll try and send them out to people on an email file. If anybody's interested, I have my email posted at the end here. The cost of the conflict for the American side, $1 trillion perhaps, and the statistics here talk about most of that, 80% or more, to the military effort. And of 40 billion spent in 2019, 35 billion were for the war effort, maybe 5 billion for reconstruction, most of that simply paying the salaries of the police and the Afghan army. So very little money over all these 20 years went into social development, infrastructure, construction, and you can see a little bit perhaps on the graph in the middle, from left to right, 2010, 2020, the human toll. And even as American soldiers withdrew from Afghanistan and took fewer and fewer casualties every year, the Afghan army, Afghan civilians, thousands killed every year, many thousands wounded, maybe 50,000 of the Taliban killed over the years. So something motivating that group to continue onward. And for our story, the number of internal refugees generated within Afghanistan has been growing for the last few years. Pakistan, always a refuge for decades for Afghans fleeing turmoil and trouble and war. And to this day, Afghans moving to Iran, to Afghanistan, and now to the West, and now to America, part of our discussion. So one of the things I've collected, the journalism about the fall of Kabul, August 15th, is really about America. It's about the political blame game. What's the role of a particular president? Did we learn any lessons? Within a few days of the fall of Kabul on August 15th, it was the Independence Day for Afghanistan. And that was the day the Taliban announced the creation of their Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, a new government, and explained. So I collected a few articles, lots of journalism, lots of discussion about it. The U.S. ignored corruption within the Afghan government. Did that lead to its fall? And we can talk about that a little bit. Or was it just incompetence of some kind? Was it the politicians' fault? Was it the military fault? Was it the Afghan army? Was it explained? So for us in America, 5 weeks ago, it seemed to be the great crisis. 5 weeks later, it's almost disappearing. Maybe that was the intention in the Biden administration. Get it done with early. It won't be an issue for the November 22 elections. But as we'll talk about today, the consequences of the change in governments are ongoing and will be ongoing for years, including in Philadelphia, including in New York, as refugees work their way through the processes and get to America. One interesting article, an Afghan interpreter for the Americans wrote an op-ed piece in the Washington Post about U.S. cultural illiteracy, just not understanding or caring to understand what the Afghan society and people were like, including relationships with women, social contacts with Afghans. A more typical article, the BBC interviewing different people. Which president is responsible? The blame game by administration. Christine Fair at the University of Washington talked about how Americans talk about wars, especially ones we lose. General McMaster, who was Trump's national security advisor, when he left the White House, they signed the deal in Doha in February of 2010, and McMaster now calls that agreement a surrender agreement. So what is going on? Historians will sort this out for years. And sadly, perhaps this is all happening on the 20th anniversary of September 11th. So quite a bit of literature, quite a bit of discussion about that. And in all the literature and journalism in the last few weeks, just a few articles about Afghan women in shelters in Kabul or how to help Afghan refugees in the United States. Most of the journalism about America, as usual. And maybe that was the problem with the war in Afghanistan. Most of the thinking about Afghanistan was really about thinking about domestic politics, careers in America, budgets, contracts, things like that. The government fell in Kabul. The Doha Agreement was that the Americans would withdraw their troops, and the Afghan different political parties would sit down with the Taliban and talk about an inclusive government that would include different political voices and women. And here is a picture after the fall of Kabul from the home of Abdullah, who was Ashraf Ghani's vice president. And this is in Abdullah's home, and Hamid Karzai is sitting there, and they're talking to the new Taliban governor, acting governor for Kabul. And there were several days when they had meetings with all kinds of people, and this was the lip service to that inclusive government. The Taliban are a new Taliban. The cell phone coverage never dropped. The Twitter accounts kept going. Social media. The Taliban have learned to play the modern game. And the 1990s Taliban walked into a destroyed Kabul and took over a really crushed economy. Now they're taking over a thriving city in Kabul with millions of people, and something that they want to maintain. Is that possible? What is interesting for the Doha Agreement is that it was negotiated by the Americans directly with the Taliban and Afghan politicians who were not in Ashraf Ghani's government. And the last time that happened, Henry Kissinger cut a deal directly with North Vietnam to pull the Americans out of Vietnam without consulting the South Vietnamese. And so the same kind of result at the end. The new government in Kabul, the reality is the Ministry of Women Affairs has been renamed the Ministry for the Propagation of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice, a familiar social policing that has been done under the Taliban in the past and done in other countries with this same kind of rubric of social control. So how do we understand and think about what's happened in Afghanistan? And I'll have several books here that I've recommended to people over the years to try and understand why Americans don't understand this part of the world or Afghanistan. And a lack of cultural knowledge, understanding, empathy, sometimes willful, sometimes just out of ignorance. Who exactly was the enemy? The last Kabul drone strike shows even at the very end, even in the capital city, they made a mistake. They just simply didn't know. They guessed and killed civilians instead. The idea that regime change of military power was enough. This goes back to the Bush administration and Rumsfeld, chasing out all the NGOs and the State Department. Can military power be enough? And the recent history of American involvement overseas, from Vietnam to Iraq, Libya, and Yemen, is it can change a government, but it cannot change a society. So part of that, denying the politics and the moral universe of the enemy. There are legitimate critiques of undemocratic, corrupt allies in Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and the Taliban took advantage of that. A book I recommend, Come Back to Afghanistan, written by Syed Haider Akbar, who as a high school student went to visit his father after the fall of Taliban. His father went back to Afghanistan from California and became a governor in one of the eastern Afghan provinces. And Syed visited the town. He talked to Americans. He talked to the Afghans in the town in eastern Afghanistan. The Americans asked him to get one of the Afghans to come in for some questioning about something that had happened. And Syed convinced the Afghan to trust the Americans, to go talk to him. And while in custody, he was questioned and beaten to death. And Syed Haider Akbar starts to learn about the lack of cultural communication between Americans and Afghans, and he writes a book about it. Another book, Sarah Chase, The Punishment of Virtue. She was an NPR reporter and went to Afghanistan after the fall of Taliban and stayed in Afghanistan, lived in Kandahar, and worked with Afghan people to help develop the economy, to learn more. And she learned over the years, especially as she became close to the government in Kandahar, run by the brother of Hamid Karzai, that they were really self-serving, corrupt, basically gangsters. And she started to make some distance between her and that government, and came back disillusioned, I think, a bit, and has written books about corruption in the world and Afghanistan since then. But the punishment of virtue, good intentions aren't enough in a country that is terribly complicated, that people don't understand. So expedient, often bad policies, often poorly executed. As early as 2003, the invasion of Iraq pretty much wrote off Afghanistan as a venue of serious interest and effort in Washington. And the shortcut then for success in Afghanistan seemed to be the patronage of discredited militias. Corruption was ignored. There was little accountability in Kabul or Washington, and it rolled on for years and years. The Americans don't ever have to lose anywhere. They can stay forever. And that was part of the strategy for Afghanistan, kick the can down the road. The problem for corruption, one of the warlords they supported from the north, Dostum, an Uzbek clan leader who was vice president of Afghanistan after the Taliban, his militias did not stay and fight the Taliban a month or two ago. They drove over the border into Central Asia. A New York Times reporter walked through Dostum's Kabul mansion, and it's available to look at the tour of this incredible mansion in the middle of Kabul. The money that Dostum was given to support his militias ended up paying for a luxurious lifestyle for him and his friends. He returned to Turkey, probably, where he has another home, I think, probably as big as this one. So, and people in Kabul could see that corruption. They knew what was going on. Didn't have a lot of faith in the government or the militias. So for the last 20 years, there have been gains in Afghanistan, social and cultural possibilities, education for women, women's shelters, a wonderful book written by Sonia Hassan Tirmizi, Runaway Women in Post-Taliban Afghanistan, talks about Afghan women running away from bad marriages, arranged marriages, looking for opportunities for autonomy, taking shelter in Kabul. But then, what were their chances after that? And always fighting court cases and having problems. It's a wonderful book. Sonia, an anthropologist who went and stayed in the shelters and talked about problems for women. After the fall of the Taliban in 2001, new laws, a new constitution, legal protections for women, minorities, arts, music, sports, prospered in the cities at least. Opportunities, millions of young girls and women getting to schools, joining the universities, but always in the background, the reality, especially in the countryside, of Taliban shadow governance, courts, influence, violence, assassinations. And as Sonia tells in her book, the reality, even under the post-Taliban government, women still constrained within a greater patriarchy. So the problem of what happens now for the shelters for women in Afghanistan, a very critical moment now for them. So after September 2021, a new Taliban government, not inclusive, all men, 30 Pashtuns, 1 Uzbek, 2 Tajiks, all male Taliban hardcore members, a new round of deputy cabinet members, still all male. And it seems that they have an ambition now to be like Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, Pakistan. Implement your Islamist authoritarian policies, be market friendly, open to investment, allow business, allow the media to operate, maybe censored, but it operates. Everybody's cell phones are working, or, generally some kind of communication allowed, degrees of modernity without cultural or political compromises. And so that's not looking very good for the Afghan urban middle classes, looking for a continued existence of their previous lifestyles. So my last slide, what next? And I can turn it over to our other speakers for some discussion of that. Refugees, migrants, what happens today in 2021? 1 million migrants entered Europe in 2015 from Syria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and there's little empathy left in many countries for new refugees. The Pakistan border these days relatively closed to refugees. The Afghan politicians, the wealthy, the warlords have gone off to the Emirates, to London, to Turkey. 125,000 evacuated from Kabul recently. Many of them coming to the United States, many of them already here, many of them already in New Jersey. I'd like to know, one of my questions for our guest speakers, are they being released to be resettled through Philadelphia or New York at this point? The urban, the educated, the allied to the US, social and women's activists, human rights advocates, journalists, artists, what doors will open for them? And in my courses, I teach Exit West, Mohsin Hamid's a novel. He's a Pakistani novelist writing about this crisis of people leaving and going somewhere else, and the world changes. So let me stop there. I'm Robert.Nichols at Stockton.edu. If anybody's interested in some of this material, I can forward that to someone on an email file. And let me pass it on here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nichols. Sunita Viswanath, please.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sunita Viswanath, co-founder, board chair of Women for Afghan Women. And I have a very different, I really appreciate the political, historic background information that we just heard from our colleague. My presentation will be much more a day in the life of a nonprofit organization. So it's just not an academic, I'm a grassroots activist. And Women for Afghan Women was founded right here where I am in New York City in the year leading up to 2001. A number of us, maybe a lot of people here are too young to be among that generation, but many people were extremely upset, disturbed, horrified at the news coming out of Afghanistan back in the late 90s when the Taliban had taken over the country. I was one of them and was working in a women's foundation and thought that I would make a grant happen, give a grant to a group of women in New York who wanted to do something about Taliban rule in Afghanistan and human rights and women's rights. And those explorations to find somebody to give a grant to led to the creation of Women for Afghan Women. In that year leading up to 9/11, basically, a group of people sort of solidified. It started out with exploration, but then a group of people came together to be a group that met regularly. And we were planning a conference, first of all, that was supposed to take place in fall of 2001. And also some of us, especially me, very, very committed to grassroots community-based change. So we, over that year, went regularly to Queens, New York, where there is an Afghan community, the third largest in the country. And so we made inroads into the grocery stores, the mosques, the Afghan library that existed back then. There was a group of Afghan women from Queens. Some of them were the moms of some of our group, because a lot of the women in our group that was nascent at that point were students. And so we learned from talking to women that, and this was no surprise as an immigrant from India, that the issues that women in Queens were telling us we should work on if we created an organization were domestic violence, forced underage marriage, where girls were taken to Pakistan to marry them off underage. And there were even cases where girls in Queens were kept home from school when they hit puberty. And so these were the sorts of issues that we hope to address. But we thought that we would have all the time in the world to build whatever we were building, because no one cared. Even in the women's movement, when conferences would take place, I would sometimes sit outside the conference with a table, because the women's movement conferences had so much on their plate that they couldn't add Afghanistan back then. And in general, in the society at large, talking about Afghanistan, you would meet sort of glazed eyes. Nobody knew where it was, how to spell it, what was going on. So that was the pre-9/11, thing that I was doing on top of my job with others. Then when 9/11 happened, what was remarkable to me was that the Afghans in our initial group knew instantly that not only had they been attacked in New York, that Afghanistan would be bombed. I wasn't so sophisticated a thinker that it took me a while to figure it out. But our Afghans knew it, in our group, knew it right away. And sure enough, October 7th, US started bombing Afghanistan. And so there was this attack on both homes of the Afghans that I was close to. After 9/11, and also what was apparent immediately was that the Afghan women in our group had been preparing without knowing 9/11 was coming, they had been preparing to take a world stage. So whether it was teach-ins in colleges around New York, whether it was speaking to the press, whether it was speaking to funders who would then fund Women for Afghan Women, we had a cohort of young Afghan women ready to speak and advocate. So the pillars of the organization at our founding, we were founded in April 2001. That's when we were incorporated. There were two pillars. One was advocacy for human rights and women's rights, and the other was a devotion to grassroots community change. And over the 20 years, we have held on to those two pillars. If we advocate, the thing that gets us entry into the rooms where policy is discussed and decisions are made is the fact that we work deep in community and we are privy to the intimate lives of Afghan women. That is what gives us the knowledge to go and speak. So in Queens, then, we built our first program the New York Community Center. It's right there in Fresh Meadows. Any of you can go. And so the Community Center in Queens is our oldest program, and it's a community center rather than a women's center. So the women who come, the community in Queens, New York is different from the other Afghan communities around the country that I've seen, in that the other communities, it's an ethnic difference and an affluence difference. The Queens community is mostly Pashtun, mostly not just undereducated, but uneducated and very, very low income. And so when in the early days, we made an ESL curriculum with the help of ESL experts, and we learned that whatever is considered an ESL curriculum takes for granted literacy in some language. Well, our women that were coming to our door in Women for Afghan Women were not literate in any language. And so we had to create curriculum from scratch. So that's how we began. And the programs that we built in Queens had to respect the religion of the community that was coming in the door. And we couldn't say we were a women's rights organization. We said we focused on the rights of families, human rights, and anyway, the women that were coming to our door didn't want to be separate from their family. They came with children, they came with their parents, they came with their husbands. If we alienated their families, they wouldn't be able to come. And so we had literacy classes for women and men. And we had girls empowerment classes, and we have boys empowerment classes. And it's the way, and sometimes funders would say, well, in your girls, and by the way, funders would often only want to know about the work with girls and women. And we would sometimes be quiet about the work we did with families and men just because we needed the support. And the American foundations didn't really want to hear about it. But when we, a funder once said to us, why do you only have, this was years ago, our programs have grown over the years, but back then, why do you only have 13 girls in your girls empowerment class? And we would have to explain the amount of time that it took to keep those 13 girls in our class, because we would have to keep visiting the families and ensuring them that nothing we were doing in our center would in any way go against their religion and their values. So over these 20 years, the Queens Community Center, the New York Community Center, has grown, and it is a thriving center that is right now positioning itself to hopefully lead refugee resettlement. So that's the work in New York that started in 2001. By the time 2005 or so came along, our first leader of the organization, Manija Nadri, she expressed to us, the board, that she wanted to take this work to Afghanistan. By the way, in 2003, you mentioned, Robert, Sarah Chase's book. In 2003, we made our first foray into Afghanistan as an organization, and we held a conference in Kandahar hosted by Sarah Chase. And it was called Women's Rights in the Constitution. And as the Constitution was being written in Afghanistan, we had 30 grassroots women's rights activists. That's what they were. They wouldn't have called themselves that. From provinces all around the country come to Kandahar. And each one was chosen because she had done something incredibly brave during the Taliban time. And those 30 women got together and basically wrote a Bill of Rights. You know, the question was, if you wanted to influence the constitution of your country, what would go into that constitution? And there was a Bill of Rights that was written in Dari, translated into Pashto and English. And we went to Karzai's palace. We took those 30 women to Karzai's palace. And one of the women said, and we gave this Bill of Rights, and one of the women said, we're here because a few American women came and made this bridge. When will it be that we can just walk into our nation's, capital and be treated with respect? So that was 2003. And what we saw on that 2003 trip was what led Manija to say, we need to go and work in Afghanistan. And so by 2005, when she said this, we had been basically building a methodology of doing work within Islam for women's rights. And we went to Afghanistan, she went to Afghanistan and did a 6-month feasibility study, where she went with the idea of shelters. But what we ended up doing, based on everything we learned from that feasibility study, was to create the Family Guidance Center. So I'm now going to tell you quickly what the work was for all of these years in Afghanistan. The centerpiece was the Family Guidance Center, which is an open location center. It started in Kabul, grew to 14 provinces across the country. And the Family Guidance Center was a place that anybody could come who had a human rights violation. And mostly women came, but sometimes men came. And the first thing that we would do is use a very deeply Afghan traditional mediation conflict resolution practice, which is called the jirga. So we would make jirgas around the woman or the man, but mostly women who came. And in a circle would be whoever she said needed to be there. Husband, in-laws, parents, other elders, sisters, imam, whoever she said needed to be there for her. And then we would add our mediation staff. And we would figure out a process to solve the problem that was going on. And in most cases, we would resolve this to the extent that she could go home and be safe. And the men and the women were offered counseling in our centers around the country. And what was shocking to me, because in the States, when I've worked on domestic violence, you often have to court mandate men to go into counseling. Well, in Afghanistan, in each province that we worked, the men welcomed the opportunity to talk. When somebody said, what's going on with you? What's your story? Are you okay? Nobody had asked them that. And so on the day in Kabul where I've seen this, where it was the day for because the male counselors came on a different day to the female counselors, on the day that it was the male counseling day, the line was around the corner of men waiting for their appointments. And they were talking and laughing with each other openly about whatever was going on. And I had never seen that before. So that was the work. The Family Guidance Center, each one had a secret shelter for those cases where the women couldn't go back home. But those were the minority cases. Most women could go back home. And then we had the work with children. In 2003, we learned that when women went to prison in Afghanistan, often children went with them. So we built these beautiful residential centers. The New Yorker called it an oasis in the middle of a war zone, these beautiful children's support centers. And it was girls and boys, and there was trauma counseling, there was school, and they were my favorite program. So and there's lots more too, but we were doing this work. We were in 14 provinces. The only reason we weren't in 34 provinces was funding. And our largest funder, and this is very, very relevant, our largest funder over these years for the work in Afghanistan was the US State Department. And they still are. I mean, that funding hasn't been pulled. So here we were, we grew into the largest women's organization for Afghan women, Afghan women's rights organization in the world. And our largest funder was the US State Department. And we were doing this work. And we were very aware of the political background that has just been described to us very well. But as a grassroots organization, we were building our theory of change, and the organization we were building and scaling was one that didn't, other than money, it didn't depend on the world being in Afghanistan. This is 100% of our, at this point, 1,200 staff in Afghanistan are Afghan, and we hire locally wherever we work. And the work is deeply, deeply respectful and built within the context of not just Islam, but Sharia law. I've been interviewed many times since August 15th by journalists, and I'm just really disappointed that many of them think that when the Taliban just said they'll respect women's rights under Sharia law, that that's some new headline. Well, that was pre-August 15th too. The Constitution of Afghanistan deferred to Islam and Sharia. So, I was very appalled that journalists seem to think that that was new. The question is who's Islam and which Islam and which Sharia. That's what we need to see. So right now, we are in a state of deep despair, anguish, depression. And the first 11 days were spent day and night working on trying to get people out. And we had already spent months evacuating people from the 14 provinces to Kabul, because we really thought Kabul wouldn't fall so quickly and Kabul would be safe. And we could try and get people out of Kabul slowly. But that didn't happen. Nothing shocked us except how rapidly this happened. And so we managed to evacuate 500 of our most at-risk, front-facing, in the press and in the courts, whose names were known, staff and their families, and clients who had nowhere to go. I hate that term clients, but it's the word that the organization uses for the people that we serve. And we reintegrated as many of the women in our shelters and children's centers as we could. And there was this group left who were with us in Kabul. We did not, after 11 days of working closely with the State Department, 3 times. There were planes on the tarmac, and the Taliban checkpoints weren't stopping us. We cannot blame it on the Taliban. It was the US State Department and the Department of Defense that had the power to open the gate to the airport. 3 times we were almost at the airport and went back because they refused to open the gate. And they will cite security reasons. I don't know what their reasons are. That's above my pay grade. I just know that our women and our people, who we are saying as the largest women's organization, we are saying these are the ones who will be killed, did not make it onto that evacuation plan. And I don't know, that is the truth. And we are still trying to evacuate. But at this point, Women for Afghan Women cannot do open evacuations. That will, because we'll only get, if we're lucky, a few out, and everybody else will be targeted. So we're doing quiet, if any of you have contacts that can help get 3 people right now on our staff are going to be killed. They're in bunkers and they're going to be killed. And it isn't the Taliban that's going to kill them. Over these years, we have put so many perpetrators away in jail, and the jails are emptied. So those men are coming for our staff. And those are the people who are threatening them and are saying they're going to come and kill them. So that's one emergency right now. The other emergency, if you know this from the news, but it's a humanitarian emergency. Our staff, we are paying them into their bank accounts, but they cannot access their money. The banks, and the lines outside Western, I don't even know if Western Union is still open, but the lines were long and dangerous. And so our staff cannot access money for food. One of our staff gave birth in a northern province and she didn't have cash. This was a week ago. And so this is our staff. And so you imagine people who don't even have, the poorest in Afghanistan. There's going to be a famine if we do not put pressure on this government to figure out a way to open up a channel for money to reach Afghanistan for humanitarian purposes. That's the next thing that needs to happen. And I don't know what will happen if we can't even get $200 to our guard or our security manager. So that's the second. Third is, so on the America side, whether it's our staff or our community, there's a real political correctness sort of disease in our Western countries where we cannot say that in order to exist in Afghanistan, we need to figure out how to deal with the new government. That means talking to the Taliban. I mean, to me, it's like, duh, of course they're the government, of course we have to talk to them, but we can't even say that openly. And so on the Afghanistan side, we have said our organization will do everything humanly possible to remain in Afghanistan and do work, but we don't know what that means. We don't know if women can work. We don't know if girls can go to school, although in Kandahar, in our Children's Support Center, our kids, girls and boys, are going to school. So it's different in different provinces. But we are in the midst of negotiations for our work. And we believe that if we can do work with refugees, which we are doing right now, and with IDPs, if that is allowed, and the Taliban have told us that's okay, and if we can do work with children, and we have been told that's okay, and if we can do work with widows, and we've been told that's okay, we want to stay and do that work and build from there. And we have told the Taliban that Muslim women who are abused and abandoned, if they don't want to run shelters today, there will be a day that they will come to us and say, this is a problem, we need your help figuring it out. So we believe if we stay our course, the time will come when we can do some work on women's rights as well. But we did not make this new reality. The world made this new reality. America made this new reality. And we want to stay and do the work. And so people who have donated to us need to be patient. Right now, we cannot even get money to our staff. And in time, we will know what programs we can run, and we will need the money we are raising to do that work. So American donors are saying, what are you doing with the money we gave you? I don't know how to answer that question right now. I think the question is just outrageous. Third, on the US side, if there's anything keeping me going right now, because the dam hasn't burst since August 15th, I have just been holding stress and worry and concern. I was just before this on a similar call where my Afghan colleague broke down. Her 2 nephews were killed in the explosion, the famous explosion that happened at the airport, and she just had to come to work. We haven't given our staff on this side time to deal with what's going on. And she broke down on this call, and I am holding on. And those of us who are not Afghan are not as close to the trauma of this, and we're holding space. And so and the thing that's keeping me going is the fact that there's so many concrete things we can do on the US side. So Women for Afghan Women is building. We've always had our New York Community Center that is understaffed, underfunded. But right now we have money to build. We're hiring staff attorneys, and we're starting a community center in Virginia where there is urgent need. And so that is happening right now. We are working on the refugees that are already here. I don't know about New Jersey, I'll find out, but in Virginia, they're on a base called, I think, Fort Lee. We have a 500 strong volunteer base, and one of our associate board members, who's an attorney, has just taken time off work, and she's just doing this right now. And so we are accompanying people to doctor's appointments, lawyers' appointments. We're getting food, Afghan food, to people, and we're bringing imams to the base. And that's the kind of work we're doing. And we're advocating that the money for refugee resettlement has to come to organizations like ours. Otherwise, the people are going to be re-traumatized all over again by our system. And in New York, where our center is, we've been told that thousands of refugees are about to land, but we will be given for security reasons, 3 hours notice before each plane lands. So we're getting ready, we're on standby to greet those people. And already there are some people in New York, and many of them are minors who have arrived without parents. And they're in this center called Cayuga Center in the Bronx. There is nobody on staff there that speaks Pashto or Dari. And we've been trying to say, can our families in Queens foster them? But the families would need to get the kids all the way over there by 7:30 in the morning. It would be a 2.5-hour drive in rush hour, and then bring them back. Which family can do that? I've just told you, it's low-income working families. So we're fighting for the right to take care of these families that are arriving. So those are the 3 buckets of immediate work: the evacuations, the figuring out what work we can do in Afghanistan, and the refugee resettlement work. And then on top of all of that is the advocacy that goes along with this frontline work. And that, depending on what you all can do in your individual capacities, those are the areas where I would say we need help. And of course, money, because the US State Department is telling us that it is a question whether our grants with them will remain, because the US government has a problem working with terrorists. I don't know what to say to that, except that we have been fed to those terrorists. And they didn't even get one of our people out. So we need to remain and work even if we lose our largest funding, and we will. I know we will. What we built was built on completely audacious, like magical thinking. So we will summon up what it takes to figure out how to live. I mean, not me, but our people in Afghanistan. But if people here can understand that we're about to lose our major funding, and so whatever we are given in terms of funding now, we will save for the moment where we are able to spend it in Afghanistan. And every day, in the earliest days of WA, in Afghanistan, I would tell our executive director, why are we expanding when we haven't evaluated the program we're doing already? And when I went and saw with my own eyes what it is that we do, I never said that again, because each day that we're open, lives are saved. I know that. And so I'll stop there. I probably went over my time, but that's the situation, and I'm grateful for the chance to share.
Thank you so much, Sunita. Could you please also put your email and contact information in the chat if people would like to contribute or can help in any way? Thank you so much. Dr. Husnul Amin, please.
Thank you so much, Raz, Robert, and Sunita. It was moving, and it was emotionally charging, actually. Unfortunately, here I'm sitting and in Islamabad, the discussion is not about the miseries, Afghans and the Afghan women and children, but it's only about the withdrawal. And it's a kind of celebration. People are celebrating that the Taliban have conquered Afghanistan and they have actually, defeated a superpower in the West. So that's actually the predominant debate and discussion going on in the media, as well as people are celebrating, glorifying these ideas here. So recently I was sitting in a Pashtun hujra, and the discussion going on, just elders were sitting and they were discussing that what kind of decision has Biden taken, and the haste, and wasn't there a better withdrawal strategy than the current one? Because actually everyone has been endangered with this current decision. So I will be presenting about the Pashtun people living across the border on the Pakistani side, and what could be the possible impact on the Pashtun culture, society, politics, economy. And so before discussing that, you might have heard about the Dividend Line, which actually divides Afghanistan and Pakistan. And the line separates both countries. It was agreed upon by the British Secretary to India, Dividend, as well as the Amir Abdul Rahman in 1893. So it actually divides the Pashtuns tribes. So some people like Shinwari tribe, some people are living here and some are living there. So it's, as is the usual case globally in the partition, the flawed partition, the boundaries, the artificial boundaries which have been drawn. So some people are living here and some are there. So there is actually the people have relatives on the other side, and some people are living on this side, and there is this infiltration issue. And the border, the people living in the tribal belt, it used to be called FATA, the federally administered tribal areas, which was regulated by the frontier crime regulations. In that area, in that territory, which is almost 2,700 kilometers long, border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and like it's 1,640 miles long. It passes through the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province as well as the Balochistan province, and it is actually connecting 10 provinces on the other side of the border in the Afghanistan. So during the Afghan war, there was a huge impact on this area, and this was highlighted in the news. The tribal belt, Waziristan, and these might you have heard about these. So this area became actually a safe haven for the terrorists and militants. All global terrorists were brought over here, and they were populated here in this area. Their training camps were here. Then the jihadi madaris were established for their training, for their religious training as well. So there's a whole episode which we are aware of, and it created a lot of havoc and mayhem in Pakistan. In 2006, the Taliban, which were not an organized and a cohesive group in Pakistan, they organized themselves under the TTP, under the title TTP. TTP is Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, which is the movement for the Pakistani Taliban. So they established themselves in the tribal belt, and then they started their terrorist activities and attacks. So before I discuss the potential impact of the recent changes which have taken place in Afghanistan, let me just give a brief framework in which actually I will be discussing this, because this is not the first time that there is a crisis in Afghanistan and it will be impacting Pakistan economy and the Pashtun belt. It is almost third or the fourth time in the last 40 years. So what happened in the last 3 or 4 times, was the Pashtun society, which was already actually weaponized because people keep guns and private, weapons at home. But it was extremely weaponized during the Afghan war, and all modern weapons were brought into this region, and the people had access to modern weapons. So the Pashtun culture and society was actually drastically weaponized. Then the drug trafficking started, and the poppy cultivation and the opium trade. This was started on the border side, and it had a huge impact on Pashtun society. Religious conservatism and the jihadi madaris, these actually, there was an exponential growth in the region, and it killed the moderate and the liberal narrative and the progressive narratives in society. So all secular and liberal intellectuals, musicians, artists, either they were killed or either they were compelled to leave the country and settle abroad in the Middle East and UK and everywhere. So this was something which was going on. But despite these developments, there were some positive changes as well, and which were some were mentioned by Robert. But on this side, there was a huge growth in new middle classes. So income coming from abroad as remittance. Then even the drug money contributed to that. The underground economy contributed to that. Then the productivity increased, and people had new income, and which generated a new Pashtun middle class on both sides of the border. And then there were a growth in the university campuses. So the Pashtun belt Pakistani side is having more than 40 universities now. Every district is having one modern new university, new liberal university, which is actually providing a space for interaction and engagement and discussion. And I think the same is true for the other side as well. I can see Jalalabad emerging, developing as a city like Peshawar, and a new middle class emerged in the last 20 years on that side as well. Also the universities and growth in media and cell phones. If you go back to 2001, you will see there is zero cell phone, but you will see now 90% of the people having access to cell phones, smartphones. Then the girls' enrollment, actually, I think it's more than 80% now, as according to the World Bank statistics. So this all, this rupture in these things created a rupture in the tribal formation as well on both sides. And we had these new social movements, which is called the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, the new civil rights movement, which was initiated in the tribal belt, and they were asking for constitutional rights, freedom of expression, identities, language and culture, and these things. And unlike the traditional old guard nationalists, these new social movement activists, they were talking, within the ambit of the Pakistani constitution. So they were mainly focusing on the constitutional freedoms guaranteed in the Pakistani 1973 constitution. So these discussions were going on before the Taliban, they made advances in Afghanistan. Just very quickly, I will focus on a few things. One is that we don't have, a data on which the basis of which we can predict what is going to happen, but we have a historical data and information, and something as anecdotal account which is going on and which is going actually to change the many things in Pakistani society and specifically the Pashtun belt. The first thing is a narrative building and strengthening of the narrative that a conservative social force like Taliban can defeat the world most modern military and the resourceful countries. So this narrative is so much damaging locally that now there are discussions within the Pakistani Taliban that if we can defeat Americans in the West there, why can't we defeat Pakistani military in Pakistan? Like, this is just possible for us because we defeated there. So, this whole withdrawal strategy created so much space for these narratives. In Pakistan, in Islamabad, in the capital city, just today it's going on, the Red Mosque. The dilemma of the Red Mosque last year. They are now wavering the Taliban flag now. And they say that we are supporting them, and we need and we want actually that kind of system in Pakistan. And then, there is a tremendous growth in bomb blasts in different places, specifically in Waziristan and the Balochistan area. So a kind of narrative is in the making, and people are celebrating that narrative as well. The second thing is, just assume if there is no inclusivity in the government, and there is the ethnic and the religious tensions mount to a certain level, and there is a humanitarian crisis, for example, which is actually there. Sunita mentioned some, and I knew that people say that there is 1 million children and actually may die due to hunger. And similar other stories are coming up. So if that situation arises in Afghanistan, then that could lead to a civil war, and that civil war could lead to another, more dangerous thing, which is the emergence of the ISIS, the Daesh, the ISIS Khorasan, which is already there. And they have splinter individuals here in Pakistan as well. And they have an enormous lethal capacity to create actually larger, damage than the Taliban. At a certain point, we all have to make then choices. Taliban, the lesser evil, versus the bigger evil, which will be the Daesh. So you see, I think the global international community should also consider this thing as well, that the evil which is Taliban, maybe at a certain point you will consider it a lesser evil than the one which is in the making in the region. If you consider the historical data in Iraq, when I think it was 500,000 soldiers were like they lost their jobs. And these people were readily available to Daesh, and there was the recruitment of the Baas party and the activists, the secular people. Here you see, I was just today asking one Afghan colleague that what happened to the 300,000 soldiers, which actually the Biden is repeatedly talking about. Where are they now? So they are jobless. They are not having salaries. And they are readily available for, very well trained in modern technologies and everything. And they are available for, if there is some financial support for them, they can be hired and recruited by the militant organizations, which could be then a lethal thing. Another thing is, if the Taliban, if they do not keep up to the promises and their ideological commitments, then there will be huge secessions in the movement, because people, they have trained in the last 20-30 years that we will bring that ideal kind of caliphate and Islamic state and stricter version of Sharia. So if they don't bring that, and of course they can't do that because they are looking for recognition. As Robert mentioned, that their entry into Kabul was not like in the 90s, and they are considering several changes as well, and they are looking forward to recognition. So for that, they will make several compromises. So a secession from within the ranks of Taliban has already started, and those who believe and who were indoctrinated and who were trained in a very strict mode of Sharia, they are now looking forward to, Daesh and such organizations which can truly implement that kind of a global caliphate and like that. So these were few things I just wanted to discuss. And just as a final word, I would say, what is the way forward actually? We need actually an inclusive government. This is just a debate going on everywhere. And we need, we should not actually, as a global community, focus on, expecting a liberal kind of Western democracy. And that was not what Taliban aimed for. At most, what we can expect is just to ensure that they avoid the humanitarian crisis and they ensure and guarantee very minimum basic human rights. And then we can enter into, a long run process in which many other changes can be brought in. Thank you so much actually, and I'm under pressure of time. So because another speaker has to present as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Husnul Amin. Lucy, Rabbaa, please.
Okay, let me share my screen here. All right, can everyone hear me? Perfect. Hello, my name is Lucy Rabbaa, and I'm the Director of Social Services at HIAS Pennsylvania. I'm so happy and honored to be invited to this event to talk about the Afghan evacuees and refugees, not in Pakistan, not in New York or in Virginia, but here right where we are in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. In the next 15 minutes or so, I will provide a brief overview of who these Afghan arrivals are, who arrived in the United States in the past 1 month through the large scale of the evacuation effort called Operation Allies of Welcome. Among those, some of them will be resettled here in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Number is not really big compared to Virginia or California or Texas, but there will be a significant number who will be resettled here. So I'd like to wrap up my presentation on how you can get involved and join this effort to help alleviate the Afghan humanitarian crisis and welcome these Afghan refugees into our community. My presentation will focus basically on the day-to-day operational aspect of working with Afghan arrivals. But before I dive into my discussion, my presentation, I'm really grateful for hearing from all of you about the political history, what's going on the ground, the women's rights, in Afghanistan, New York, and Virginia, as Sunita mentioned, and then knowing what's going on in Pakistan. It was really eye-opening, and it really gives me even more energy to continue my work, even though it's been quite challenging, as you can imagine, that I started looking at my work from a very different lens and from different lights. I really appreciate that. It really, in a way, revigorating my work and have come from my commitment to doing the work that I do right now. So, all right, first a little bit about, let me see if I can, how to go to the next slide. Oh, there you are. Okay. So just a little bit about about myself and the agency that I work with, HIAS Pennsylvania. We are a refugee resettlement agency operating in the Philadelphia area, providing legal and social services to refugees, immigrants, and asylum seekers. Earlier this month, we proposed to the State Department that we will resettle 100 Afghan refugees in the next 6 months. That is equivalent of 17 individuals a month. Okay. So just to give you just up to date, since we heard that the US troops will withdraw, that was in August, we had 2 families who arrived and one kind of what we call walk-ins because of the uncertainty and safety issues, that people will just book their own flights instead of waiting for IOM, which is International organization of migration will book the tickets for them. So the people just scrambled and tried to get out. So we had like walking cases and also booked it through, coming through the regular pipeline. Those are the SIVs. I'll get to what SIV means, in a minute. But we also, since we had some of the people who were evacuated and are currently, being processed at military bases, they're also coming to our agency. And actually, as I speak, there are 2 families who are supposed to arrive in Philadelphia airport from Fort Lee, Virginia. So that's really what I do every single day. Just I'm on standby basically to see when and who is arriving, and assure cases. Assure is meaning just confirm that yes, we are here to work with the family that you assigned to us. So this is like my agenda, talking about Afghan refugees and the Pennsylvania, New Jersey in particular, and how you can get involved in how to give help. So, all right. So according to the Migration Policy Institute, the Biden administration anticipates that 65,000 Afghan evacuees will have entered the US by the end of September, with additional 30,000 expected over the next 12 months. Having just experienced the loss of homes, communities, and livelihoods, newly arriving Afghans now face the challenge of resettling in a new country. One complication is that Afghan evacuees are entering the United States with a different legal status, as some of you know, with important implications for their ability to access public benefits and the services. I know that many of you are familiar with this different legal status because you've been hearing a lot in the media, but I'd like to quickly go over some of the terms with you. So Afghans who have already arrived will be arriving in near future generally fall into one of the following groups. First, SIVs are special immigrant visa holders. And these visa holders worked for the US government or government contractors in Afghanistan for at least a year. Their visa also covers spouse and unmarried children under the age of 21. Priority 2 or P2 category has been created for Afghans who do not meet the minimum 1-year requirement for SIV, but who worked at any time as employees of contractors, locally employed staff, interpreters or translators for the US government, International Security Assistance Force, or refugee support. Afghans who also worked at any time for US government funded grant or cooperative agreement, or Afghans who are or were employed in Afghanistan by a US-based NGO or media organization. Now, what Sunita just shared with me really is heartbreaking, because this P2 almost, immediately when this idea came out, I was laughing at it because it is useless. Basically, this only can apply for those who are able to get out of Afghanistan. So just what Sunita said, getting to the airport is such a struggle. This is almost meaningless and useless, and it takes a really long time. So I really, I can talk about other things, but this is really not the best way of getting their legal status adjusted. But it was a proposal to cover basically people who are like, basically, catch-all, basically, to make sure that we provide protection to Afghan evacuees.
But I don't know my version here.
Oh, excuse me. Oh, again. Oh, it's not for me. Okay. And then the next category is the special immigrant parolee. So those are the people who started SIV process when they're in Afghanistan. But as you know, it takes years, who are just rejected over and over again, try again, rejected, waiting for 3-4 years, still not, approved. So by the time they came to the United States, they're still SIV applicants, and they're being processed at the military bases right now. So, but those are, as soon as they're approved, they will get all the benefits that they're eligible for. And lastly, the humanitarian parolees, this final category is for Africans who do not have any of those status that I just described to you, who would likely be seeking asylum in the United States, as this parolee status will only last for 2 years. While SIV and P2 categories will receive a green card, as you know that there's a pathway for them to be a green card holder, permanent resident, and the US citizens. But the last category, humanitarian parolees, have no path to a green card unless they can establish another basis, such as qualifying for asylum. So then, as you can imagine, this group of Afghans need legal assistance as soon as immediately, which I'll discuss in the next slide. Finally, no matter what the legal status is, either you're SIV, P2, parolees, they're all eligible to apply for work authorization, meaning they can all work as soon as their authorization card is issued. Of course, there's also delay, when it's going to be issued so they can start working, all those things are really still up on the table. And then as we speak, things are kind of like we are, building system as we go right now. So while California, Virginia, Texas will be the top destinations for this African arrivals due to the African diasporas already existing in those states before the evacuations began, 46 states will also participate in resettling these African evacuees and refugees, including Pennsylvania and New Jersey. As many of you know, Philadelphia International Airport became the second airport after Dulles Airport to receive these Afghan refugees. And I'm told that they are sent immediately to a military base called Fort McGuire, Dix, and Lakehurst in New Jersey. There, they'll go through initial immigration processing, security screening and vetting, COVID-19 testing, medical services, vaccination, application for work authorization card, as I mentioned, and other screening and support services for individuals who are neither US citizens or permanent resident. This support at the pre-designated services at the US military bases also include connecting or allocating the individuals and families to resettlement agencies for placement into communities, such as mine, the organization that I work for, HIAS Pennsylvania. The placement and support services connecting them to local resettlement services is done through a program called African Placement and Assistance Program, APA for short, and managed and coordinated by the State Department in partnership with other federal agencies, private sector, and the nonprofit agencies like ours. So for example, in Philadelphia, we have 3 resettlement agencies, including HIAS Pennsylvania, Nationalities Service Center, and Bethany Christian Services, who will work closely with the African nationals and provide wraparound services, such as soon as they arrive in Philadelphia. And as I said, that we are expecting 2 families arriving at the Philadelphia International Airport. The number of Africans that will be resettled by these 3 Philadelphia-based resettlement agencies will be around 350 individuals for 6 months between September 1st, when APA program started, until March 31st, 2022. So in New Jersey, there are 2 resettlement agencies, but they're both located in northern New Jersey, one in Elizabeth and the other one is Highland Park. But they are both agencies are committed, and they also propose their numbers to State Department to work closely with African refugees. So once these individuals and families are placed into communities, the support and assistance services begin. Agencies like ours will greet them at the airport and take them to their temporary housing, like hotels, Airbnb homes, or they can stay with their relatives, friends, families in Philadelphia, New Jersey, or they can move directly into an apartment we found for them. We'll make sure that they have access to health services, even though right now they're not eligible for Medicaid or any public benefits for the humanitarian parole status. We make sure that children will get enrolled in school, adults will go to English classes, making sure we meet their food and the material needs, and provide legal services for adjustment of status, such as assisting them to apply for asylum. Finally, I'd like to touch on how you students, faculty, and staff can be involved in this effort. I like to say, it takes a village to raise a child. And I'd like to say that we resettlement agency alone cannot do this work, but it takes the entire community of people to help these individuals to integrate into their community, into their new homes successfully. So please sign up to be a volunteer, to pick them up from the airport, to cook hot meals for them, host them in your homes, consider becoming foster parents for unaccompanied Afghan minors, teach them English, be a job mentor, hire them if you're a business owner or a hiring manager, rent your apartment or houses if you own a property or if you are a property manager, or donate to local refugee resettlement agencies. Okay, just one more and then I'm done. Sorry about that. Last but not the least, please advocate. As Sunita said, advocacy is really important right now because things are not working right at this time and the things are just evolving as we speak. So for example, HIAS Pennsylvania, working closely with the Philadelphia chapter of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, has quickly mobilized to prepare hundreds of humanitarian parole applications on behalf of Afghan nationals. But the barrier in the form of a fee of $575 per application has become a major roadblock for some. We had one family with the 12 members of their family they have to apply for the asylum application. Guess how much? 575 times 12. So that money they could not come up with. So we are fundraising also, make sure that we cover their fees. Yes, USCI will say, yes, you can apply for fee waiver. And that's additional, again, step to make sure that the fees are waived. So there's a lot of barriers to get the help that they need. So, and contact your legislators, and the president asked them to waive this fees, right now, because it's just too much and there's additional step to get the fees waived. Additionally, those who have the humanitarian parole status are not eligible for public benefits or social service, unfortunately, such as Medicaid, SNAP, the food stamps, TANF, SSI, or federally funded or state-funded employment programs. They're not eligible for any of those at all. And the current APA program will only guarantee up to 90 days of support and assistance from resettlement agencies. And it is unclear what's going to happen after this 90 days. So these parolees are, like fleeing violence and persecution and deserve the opportunity to rebuild their lives in safety, but we do not have the systems, set up yet, which really worries me a lot. And then me every day really waking up, and just like, oh, I don't know what to do. We have the refugee resettlement program in place, but it is nothing like this. We cannot really, every day I just kind of like scratch my head, I don't know what to do in this case. As Sunita said, that we really have to, hire people who know the work and know the culture, have the culture competence, linguistic, we are right now trying to hire a caseworker who speaks Dari or Pashto, but it's not challenging. It's challenging because we, have to step up as quick as possible. And those are all things that we are facing right now. But, so, it's imperative that there are robust pathways to protection to help displaced Afghans and that the federal agency who serve Afghan refugees and asylums and the communities like us, New Jersey and Pennsylvania, who welcome them, and we have the resources we need to serve them well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy, and thank you to all the speakers. Lucy, could you just stop sharing?
Okay, yep. Good.
Thank you to all the speakers. I think we have 5 more minutes until 2, but I'll be happy to go continue a bit after 2 for another 10 minutes if people want to stay. There's a number of questions. I just want to say that I think just the panel itself opened the eyes, I think, for everyone to the multi-level complexities of the crisis in Afghanistan and the border areas of Afghanistan and Pakistan, here in the US with the refugee crisis, the humanitarian work, various facets and challenges. which is itself important because a lot of the reporting, unfortunately, is still very simplistic, partial, sometimes just outright wrong. Maybe we'll give a chance. There's please take a look at the chat. There are a number of questions. There are questions about mental health support for refugees. There's a question for you, Dr. Husnul Amin, on efforts to build facilities on the border areas to support Pashtuns on both sides. And there's a number of other questions. Maybe take a look. Let's give our panelists, four panelists, an opportunity to provide maybe, if possible, 2 or 3 more minutes of responses to these questions. There are also questions about specific ways to support and help in various ways refugee work in the region. So each of you, if you can devote another 2 or 3 minutes to address these issues. Let's start according to the order. Dr. Nichols.
Thanks, Raz. A lot of concern in the questions and what to do, what could I do as an individual. It is a group, national effort that's going to have to be done. Organizations like Sunita's and Lucy's, who have been working at this for years, know how difficult it is. How do you resettle one family, get children in schools, get healthcare coverage, find a place to live, find income that keeps them in that place to live for a year or two, you would think. But the funding for Lucy, I think you have 90 days of funding, I think, typically for families to be resettled. And then, are they on their own? Can they work? What to do? What can I do as an individual? I think Sunita said, centers are there, the operations are there. Can you volunteer as a student to be an English as a second language tutor? Can you do something where your time is your investment rather than skills or money? And the longer you're involved in these organizations, you find roles to play. There are things that need to be done. People need rides, people need help. There's always a way to contribute. Especially younger people, contribute your time where it's possible. Stockton, what can be done in South Jersey? Will there be efforts to resettle people in Atlantic City? We'll find out. There are many people waiting in bases, even overseas, held at bases yet, and they're worried about disease and measles and maybe COVID, and people aren't quite moving yet as they will into the systems. When will that happen? 350 people through Philadelphia for 3 agencies. It's going to be a lot of work. How do you do it with 75 or 85,000 over the whole country? It's a major, major effort. One of the issues, there's apparently a $6 billion part of the next spending bill they've been debating endlessly for weeks that's supposed to be dedicated toward refugees. That money will come through, and then I suspect that's when there'll be movement and freeing up resettlement for people. So it seems an impossible task, but individuals can do things, and I think that's an initiative that individuals who really are concerned can go ahead and start to inquire and talk to people. I know Lucy's operation is incredible. Over decades in Philadelphia, doing different things. I've always admired Sunita's efforts up in New York, in the city itself, in Afghanistan. Amazing things can be done. So start the process. Where can you get involved? And you may not be able to do anything that seems to be major, but every little bit will help over time.
Thank you, Dr. Nichols. Sunita, please.
Yes, so I think that there's so many very concrete, urgent things that you all can do. And I think best is to email me, sunita@womenforafghanwomen.org. I'm also just going to give it out because I'll be referring you anyway, but Naheed, Naheed, @womenforafghanwomen.org, Naheed@womenforafghanwomen.org. She's our country director based in New York, but currently back and forth to DC, Virginia, because we're starting a center there. And she's coordinating hundreds of volunteers right now. So she's the one who could really tell you what you could do right now. And volunteer doctors, volunteer attorneys, and volunteer mental health providers, therapists are very, very urgently needed. And we're trying to do a lot of this on Zoom. So it doesn't matter where you are, but those are things that I would connect you to Naheed for. And then and advocacy. I mean, if you feel like you can write to your elected official and say, please free up, a channel so that money, cash, can reach hungry people, and make sure there is money for Afghan CBOs to get involved, because everything we're doing is we're pushing ourselves in as volunteers. The money isn't there for us, it's there for HIAS and amazing organizations that we have worked with all these years, because we've always been doing refugee resettlement work and we haven't needed much money because there haven't been that many. But right now we need to be leading, and we're fighting for money to do that. So that advocacy as well. And then Ramya, who I know, hi Ramya, amazing to have a friend here, is asking about this question of Western women's movement. So I don't know how to answer it. Yes, it's a real issue. It's always been an issue. I think, I don't remember, did I mention that when I was working in a women's foundation, I would sometimes get proposals from immigrant organizations who would talk about the work that they did for families and communities. And as the gatekeeper, as a young person in a foundation, I would say, you know what, go away, take that stuff out and bring it back to me and just talk about the girls and the women. And then I would push the proposal through. So then when we created Women for Afghan Women, the same thing would happen, where funders here would kind of want to know about the women and girls. And we would, if we felt like the funder was open to this and somehow like thoughtful and visionary, we could talk about the holistic work. And over the years, I must say this has improved. But when the Ms. Foundation announced, that they were broadening Take Our Daughters to Work Day to take our daughters and sons as a big announcement, like, bring out the fanfare, it was like hard to accept that when our women and women's organizations were doing this all along. It's the only way they would ever work. So, and then in Afghanistan, bringing the work to Afghanistan, there's no way you could build an organization that didn't have men in it. I mean, before August 15th, Afghanistan was Afghanistan. We had to have men, guards. We had to have men, receptionists, men who would be there to kind of keep the place safe and have, be there to answer somebody who came and said, what is going on here? I mean, in our book that we wrote in book of essays in 2003, almost every chapter by Afghan women talked about how even in the Taliban 90s, there were men who had to be, the women who like ran schools and ran beauty salons underground, did all of this very secret, very dangerous work. They had to have men by their sides so that they wouldn't be noticed. And I'm a mother of 3 sons. I want a world where, they can be empowered too. I mean, that's like not a crazy thing to say, but and one more thing about that I remember in the 20 years of doing work, so we would have these shelters and children's centers. And in the shelters, a lot of the women were teenagers. To me, they're kids. So many of the women that we took care of were young women, children in my eyes. And one thing that we would do was while they were with us, I mean, they would just be with us forever because they had nowhere to go. So one thing our staff would do was keep a lookout for good men for them to marry. And we had many marriages in our centers and shelters. So we learned very quickly not to talk about that when we gave talks in the US, because the audience would be stuck there about the ethics of doing that. Well, we don't need to talk to you about it if that's a problem for you. For us, we need to find a way to do our work so that women can live outside a shelter for the rest of their lives. And we never forced somebody to get married. So it is a real issue. And we exist in that, we exist and we do this work and we hold many realities as, an organization and people that live in many places at the same time.
Thank you very much.
I think that was actually very important for people to hear, and students and academicians to hear the context of feminism and the way it does differ. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Sunita. Dr. Husnul Amin?
Basharat has asked about so many things, industry and so many things. I think we are just talking in the context of current vulnerabilities and, the miseries, children and women. So I don't see any mobilization here in civil society. Maybe later on there would be some, but I am aware of some discussions at the UNHCR level that I think they are preparing, they are making preparations for registration and other facilities to be provided. So that's in colleges and universities. I think Pakistani Higher Education Commission is offering a lot of fellowships and scholarships to students, and they are enrolled in Pakistan. In my university here in Islamabad, we have hundreds of Afghan students and mostly funded by the Higher Education Commission of Pakistan. But one last thing is about, the Muslim countries who are organized under the OIC, Organization Office. Where are they actually? And we should be self-critical as well. This discussion is going on in one small university in New Jersey, but I'm sure there are hundreds of, if not thousands of discussions going on in humanitarian assistance and, this awareness about in the entire non-Muslim world. I must use this word just to be in the context. But what about Saudi Arabia? What about Egypt? What about Turkey and Iran and other Muslim countries? So I'm talking to Basharat, who understands my language, what we are talking to each other actually. So yeah, we should be self-critical in this context as well. How many Muslim countries have offered refugee status to the Afghans? So it's all coming from the US and Canada and Australia and different countries, in UK. They are pledging for 40,000, 30,000, 20,000. But how many pledges are coming from the rest of the Muslim world? So yeah, that's my brief answer.
Thank you. Husnul Amin. Lucy, please. Lucy.
I'll make it short. So there's two things that I really like to emphasize here. The first one is we, about a couple of weeks ago, we hosted a training for Afghan humanitarian parole application training for pro bono attorneys. So we have all the recording, video recording, and all the associated resources available. If you know anyone, you're an attorney yourself, if you have a friend who's an attorney who has never done the immigration work, but who's interested and willing to do this, that we have the whole training available. So please email me, and I left my email address in the chat. I'd be happy to send you all the information and also connect you to our pro bono attorney coordinator at our agency. The second thing is, as you can imagine, we're not like as crazy as California, Silicon Valley, or New York City, but housing is one of the most, one of the challenges. And African families that we've been working with, family size is about 5 on average. So we had one time with the 8 that we just about a month ago we settled. It was quite challenging, as you can imagine, that Philadelphia property doesn't really have the have a big houses so that can accommodate a big family like that. On top of that, the price is just crazy that we could not bring it down to the affordable rate, and we're really quite concerned that they're not going to get a job right away, start working, and then they'll have a work authorization or have a green card, so they'll be working and start working and get be on their feet. But until then, it is not for us, it's a very ethical, dilemma, that thing with the ethical decision we have to make every single day, knowing that we don't want to set them up for failure, but that's the housing market there is. So housing is really the biggest issue for us right now to work effectively with Afghan or any refugees that we work with in the Philadelphia region. We yesterday we hosted what's called the landlord outreach event, where we, invited like hundreds of landlords who own properties, and who are like interested in working with the refugees. One of the questions we hear all the time is that, well, how can I work with the people who have no credit? When they gonna do it, are they gonna have a job? Are they gonna able to support themselves? There's no guarantee. Like, how are we gonna, are you the agency who's gonna support if they don't have money to pay? All those questions, which is like a legitimate questions. So it's been really difficult for us. So if you know anyone, you are a property manager, or you have properties anywhere, in Jersey, in Philadelphia region, please contact me. We have a housing coordinator working like around the clock to really making like cold calls every single day around the clock. So I hope that people can actually help us, to alleviate this housing crisis in Philadelphia. I mean, it's kind of funny to call it a housing crisis because you can talk about like what about other places, but it is quite a concern for us. So thank you.
Thank you so much to our speakers. Thank you for the participants, for the questions. There's, of course, much more to talk about, but thank you so much, the panelists, for opening a window for us, just a small window, but into the immense complexities and challenges. There's a lot to think about, and I'm looking forward to talk about this panel with my students in my course. So thank you very much. I'm sure we'll be in touch, and I'm looking forward to continue collaborating and helping in these efforts as much as we can at Stockton. So thank you very much, everyone.